And through that route, it has also contributed to determining the conditions for how science has developed as we moved out of the 20th and into the 21st century. I think one of the places where you can see the influence of these concepts of paradigms and revolutions, you also find that in the granting world, or here I have some okay, here it is. A group from the National Science Foundation about transformative research. It's a little bit difficult to see, but that's okay, I can read it. Or they say that transformative research challenges current understandings, provides pathways to new frontiers in science, and at the bottom, it leads to the creation of new paradigm or field of science. So this idea of paradigms or wanting research or that creates new paradigms is something that also goes into that kind of thinking in the granting world. But what is more rarely recognized in the broader realm of influence of our structure is that Kuhn's space model is based upon an argument about a tension that exists between tradition and innovation, or as he also sometimes phrased it, between convergent and divergent thought. So in some of his work, he focused on the apparent paradox that on the one hand, normal science is this very highly convergent activity based upon a set of consensus. But at the other hand, the ultimate effect of work in that tradition is bound to change it. On the one hand, working faithfully within the paradigm enables scientists within the field of discipline or to move faster and penetrate deeper, or than if they kept spending time or examining all sorts of alternatives. But on the other hand, this stable, focused effort to investigate in detail each question that the paradigm presents, at the same time also ensures that it will eventually be discovered where the paradigm has limitations. And that process of changing the tradition has a particular structure. When recalcitrant problems are discovered, the previous consensus in the community on what the relevant problems are, which tools you have to use to solve them, or what an acceptable solution looks like, may dissolve, and different members of the community may start out trying different modifications or replacements of received beliefs and tools. And that distribution between conservative and innovative dispositions among the members of the community ensures a spreading of risk in the scientific community that is crucial. If no one reacted to problems in a high-risk way, there would be no possibility of change, and vice versa, if everybody reacted to each little deviation by suggesting radical changes, science would become a mess. So the way Kuhn phrased it here, at least for the scientific community as a whole, work within a well-defined and deeply ingrained tradition seems more productive of tradition-shattering novelties than work in which no similar convergent standards are involved. How can this be so? I think it's because no other sort of work is nearly so well suited to isolate for continuing and concentrated attention those loci of trouble or courses of crisis upon whose recognition the most fundamental advances in basic science depend. And also the risk spreading if all members of the community responded to each anomaly as a source of crisis or embraced each new theory advanced by a colleague, science would cease. If on the other hand, no one reacted to anomalies or brand new theories in high-risk ways, there would be few or no revolutions. So that is Kuhn's risk spreading argument. But there are also a number of assumptions underlying this analysis of how science progresses over time that may be historically contingent and which may therefore prompt us now in the 21st century to revisit the analysis and the lessons that we draw from it. First, the effectiveness of normal science in identifying and solving all the problems that the paradigm defines depends on community members being able to first effectively keep track of the development in their field. Second, largely trust what other communities have found without having to carry out or the same work themselves in its entirety. So it depends on an open communication within a manageable volume of responsible researchers. Second, the effectiveness in locating loci of trouble depends on community members being able to pursue every minor detail, leaving no stone unturned, preferably from different angles. And second, being meticulous in assessing new results, their own as well as the results of others, and being in a position to raise questions and concerns. So you need really to make sure that no stone is left unturned, be meticulous in assessment, and have an openness for criticism. And finally, the risk spreading mechanism depends on the individual community members being free to pursue alternative directions, even at a point where others do not find it particularly promising. So it also depends on some degree of freedom of research. And all of this brings me now to finally approach the 21st century, because Kuhn and others with him analyzed the situation of scientists who were working individually within disciplinary boundaries, who were able to keep track of the development of their specialty and participate in organized skepticism or anchored in the community, and expected to do so with integrity. But since then, science has increased in volume. It has become more collaborative, more interdisciplinary. It has become more dependent on funding, on considerations of usefulness, and more frequently haunted by questionable practices. So how do all these structural changes affect the way in which science develops? That's of course a question that is larger, one that one can be covered in only one talk. I have declared in my title and in my abstract that I shall focus here primarily on what I shall call the granularity of scientific research activities, and I'll come back to what I mean by that. But as a prolegomena to that analysis, I shall start from collaboration and interdisciplinarity, partially because it lays some of the foundation for analyzing granularity, and partially because these are topics that also links to several other presentations at the workshop. So I hope that will also help engagement in this group. So first, Kuhn's historical studies and his risk spreading argument was focused on individual scientists. Science today has become increasingly collaborative, with some minor variations between disciplines. It's been documented across all scientific disciplines that more and more research is reported in groups. Here is a paper that is now somewhat old, published in Science from 2007, that shows the percentage of publications are made by teams, natural science and engineering, the bad one rising from half of the papers in 1960 to around 80% of the papers in the year 2000, also an increase in social sciences, although from a lower standpoint, and arts and humanities are more rare to have co-authored production. To the right, you see the rise in mean team size, from a little less than 2 around 1960, to 3.5 around the year 2000. Similarly, 20th century science, very often disciplinary. Of course, interdisciplinary existed as well, but we have much more interdisciplinary research today. Various methodologies have been developed to document that, increasing prevalence of co-authors with different disciplinary affiliations, increasing assignment of keywords from different disciplines, increase in citations across disciplinary boundaries, this is a map based on citation patterns. And in some of my previous publications, I have argued that if we investigate those developments as a spectrum in 2 dimensions, or 1 dimension ranging from disciplinary work with cognitive convergence to interdisciplinary work with more cognitive divergence, and the other dimension in one end, individual work where our scientists are epistemically independent to collaborative work, or they're much more epistemically dependent, or we can discuss 4 ideal types of research activities. Or there is a traditional view, traditional legend, or of the scientists brought up in the same tradition to act as independent and autonomous agents. They're individually accountable for their research, and that together they can provide this community-based quality control of new results. Very often what we see in interdisciplinary fields is that people start making interdisciplinary programs so that new individuals can master all in the various areas that goes into this new interdisciplinary research field. And my argument is that very often, that is to try to restore the traditional legend that you'll again have people who are independent, autonomous, individual accountable, and you can have a community that can together provide the community, standard community-based quality control. If we look at the other end of the spectrum, a lot of our research is done collaboratively, where people divide labor among them. That can be disciplinary or interdisciplinary. And as you move towards that end of the spectrum, because of the epistemic dependent, problems start arising about accountability. Who is it that is accountable for produced work? When it's produced by authors, it is something that has been discussed a lot in the literature. And as we move up here, then we get these problems with the community-based quality control, that is seen as more difficult. And so in total, we get what I have called a second essential tension between a drive towards more collaborative interdisciplinary work for many reasons, to solve grand challenges, et cetera, but at the same time, we have this legend, the autonomous, accountable person interacting in a community that provides quality control, and that tension raises all these questions that we have today about is interdisciplinary work up to standards, what do we do about accountability, etc. And to focus here on the latter one, accountability, single authors or group authors, which has really been a major topic in the literature, with various actors coming with bringing different proposals to how we can resolve those issues. My proposal has been based on analysis of historical cases of scientific misconduct. I have argued that we should start rethinking the way we do integrity training, or a lot of the integrity training we do is sort of also based in this idea of the individual. So you can make integrity training where you tell people all the things that they're not supposed to do, and they're solely responsible for making sure that they live up to these standards. That we should focus much more on what goes on in groups and how it is that people interact with each other in groups, and talk about how trust is calibrated within groups, that when knowledge is produced in that setting, it starts from group members establishing reasons to believe that collaborators are competent, conscientious, has adequate epistemic self-assessment, that their epistemic character and truthful moral character. philosophers in the room may recognize this. There is taken very much from Hardwick's analysis or of trust, which can be brought into that kind of setting. So that's an area where I think this kind of analysis can actually also feed back into practices and assist in talking about whether we have the right kind of training for the way we set up research today. That was the first prolegometer on collaboration and interdisciplinarity, and let me then move to the granularity. Again, here I'm back to an empirical study of author team size from 2015, where they show the prevalence of different sizes of teams. Up here, this brown and blue is teams of 1 and 2 that start out being most prevalent. Down here we have a red one, that is 6 to 10 authors, which growth, and after 2005-7 becomes a more prevalent team size. So that's also one of these indications that not only do we have more and more collaboration, but we also have collaboration that tends to cluster together in bigger groups. Now, I think there are some initial qualifications to be made here that also calls for collaboration between these kind of empirical studies and historical studies, or these studies of how the prevalence of different sizes of co-author groups develop over time do not reveal in how far the increase in co-authorship reflects an increase in actual collaboration compared to a change in authorship practices. Like, for example, if we go back a century, many junior scholars would be sole authors for their work, where today are mentors, grant providers, or would be co-authors to such publications. And I think the development we have in many European countries towards paper-based dissertations instead of monograph may further add to that effect. So I think that's one area where collaboration between sociologists and historians, or historically inclined philosophers like myself, could help finding out what are the differences in authorship practices compared to collaboration practices. It could be identifying particular units, department, for example, and follow how different kind of authorships is linked to a different kind of collaboration track. When is it actually that supervisors become always co-authors to work their PhD students, right, etc., to try to figure out how much of this development reflects authorship practices and how much actually reflects collaboration practices. And second, studies of the prevalence of different sizes of co-author groups does not necessarily distinguish between different types of groups, disciplinary versus interdisciplinary, flat versus hierarchical, and that's some things that I will talk about in the rest part of my main part of my talk. So scientists do no longer primarily publish and publish work individually alone, as was the case of most of the examples that Kuhn drew on in structure when he devised his risk spreading argument, or what is represented here, very idealized, or at the top with a lot of identical actors treated as equivalent. Instead, they increasingly publish and probably also work in small to medium-sized teams. There are still people who work alone, but many work in different kinds of group. Here also are very idealized in the button that scientists cluster together. And what does this clustering or granularity or mean for the tension between tradition and innovation, between convergent and divergent thought? Is there a difference between the situation at the top and the situation at the bottom in how efficient science is in examining or in solving puzzles defined within a tradition? Or is there a difference in the openness of communication, in the manageable volume of responsible researchers? Or is there a difference between the situation at the top and the bottom, or in how efficient it is in locating the loci of trouble, leaving no stones unturned, and being meticulous in assessing from different viewpoints, and an openness for criticism? And is there a difference or in risk spreading, the freedom to pursue or different kinds or reactions to recalcitrant problems? And before I go into details, I'll start with some observations on funding policies around the globe. There are currently many funding schemes that favor large-scale funding for collaboration. And often they are organized, here is a figure from a textbook in research management, organized as rockets. With a single or just a few PIs at the top, some postdocs at the intermediate level, and then a huge fuel tank of PhD students whose work is the energy that drives the rocket forward, in the direction set by the PI. That rocket-shaped organization is generally perceived as being extremely efficient in what we can call puzzle solving, in producing impressive amounts of results within a particular area defined by the PI. And on current authorship practices, the PI will very often be senior author or on most or all publications from such a rocket. So it's very efficient for the PI to gain prominence through such a rocket, whereas the juniors can sometimes be seen almost as a consumable of the fuel tank, and you can dispose of when it's empty. Sometimes in research leadership training, or like this textbook, or in policy papers from granting agencies, or it's sometimes also mentioned that the potential high gain also comes with a high risk if the entire direction turns out to be wrong. So a little risk spreading, everything in that direction here. Or the same textbook presents as the alternative a community of stars, a star club, in the form of senior researchers from different areas of expertise, whose collaboration has a lot of flexibility to adapt to various opportunities as they arise, but is less narrowly focused in its specialization. And in my own local setting, I see several granting agencies, policy papers noting that with this organization, it's just more difficult to achieve international prominence. I'm not sure that I see strong empirical justification for that, but that's something that the granting agencies are very convinced of. So I think it's interesting and important to compare how such two models actually affect science efficiency in solving problems, locating loci of trouble, and in spreading risks, or when alternatives have to be investigated. So to do that, I'll look more closely into the inner working of groups from a philosophical perspective. I will here concentrate on three ideal types, or joint group learning, interaction among equal experts, and hierarchical integration. These are three types that I have examined together with Susan Wagenknecht some years ago, or slightly different names of the groups, where we were inspired by earlier work by Rossini and Porter down there. And after having read one of James' papers on aging effect, I'm a bit unsure whether I should mention the senior porter, if that just reflects that I'm getting old, that I have this urge to point to the early inspiration for that work. I do actually think that this paper is now taking over in citations. So there's something about our aging references that I think is interesting to discuss. But let me go to the groups. Joint group learning, where there's an intensive interaction between all group members, so that in the end, ideally, everybody ends up having the same expertise, having access to the same information. If they're all rational people, and they have the same knowledge, they ought also to draw the same conclusions, so there's consensus in that kind of group that is homogeneous, or with the intensive interaction, they have similar expertise, and they agree, they accept the same claims for the same reason. However, one of the supposed epistemic benefits from collaboration is its efficiency. It's supposed that collaborations enable scientists to produce more work at a faster pace than they could have done alone, because they divide labor among them. And in joint group learning, there's little to no division of labor, and hence it's not particularly efficient, neither in puzzle solving, nor in locating loci of trouble. My expectation is that because it's so labor intensive, it's a type of collaboration that we only rarely see in practice and research, although some have seen it as a solution to some of the accountability issues. In contrast, it's very often what we require of students when they do collaborative work as students, that's a side topic that I won't pursue here, but I think it can be used for discussing whether we actually train students the right way for working collaboratively, or if what we require of them as students is radically different from how research is done in practice. The other ideal type, interaction between equal experts, or there's interaction between group members, that's very similar to the startup model, where there's interaction between group members with different expertise, where there are various contributions interlock. In contrast to group learning, group members do not end up being all experts in everything, or there's a division of labor according to expertise, or they may form what philosophers have termed a heterogeneous consensus, where they agree on the same claims, but for different reasons. But it's not given from the outset how actually such joint conclusions are drawn and by whom. There's much work in social epistemology over the last decades that have focused on that, whether it's I read some changes this morning, and now this doesn't fit. Not given how and by whom overall conclusions are drawn, or social epistemology discusses whether they're characterized by joint commitment, if they're characterized by shared cooperative activities, or yesterday we also saw some other of the proposals that have been brought forward by social epistemologists. I think that in social epistemology, we tend to discuss which of these models is the right model, but maybe we should focus more on whether different models capture different types of groups, or whether it's different for interdisciplinary groups and disciplinary groups, or etc. So how do they work out with respect to the Kuhnian argument? Puzzle solving efficiency, well, efficiency in solving primarily interdisciplinary puzzles, where you need to bring together these various forms of areas of expertise. the ability to locate loci of trouble and risk spreading. We do have division of labor, we do have cognitive divergence that enables different viewpoints, that enables people to pursue different ideas. But the abilities of doing that will depend on what kind of joint commitments or shared cooperative activities you have in the group. So there is some inner working that is quite important for knowing whether you're well fit to locate loci of trouble, and whether you can have a spreading of risk within the group. And sometimes it will require renegotiation of shared aims, of joint commitments, and sometimes it may even split groups. The last ideal type I would talk about here are hierarchical integration, where the PI rocket model, where the PI synthesizes findings, this hierarchical integration requires the integrating leader to have sufficient expertise to be able to handle all party contributions. So there's a strong requirement on the expertise of the PI if the rocket is not very narrow. It's very transparent by whom conclusions are drawn, although the process through which it's adopted by group members may vary. And here I think we also need more work in social epistemology, or in ways that puts much more emphasis on such phenomena as submission and deference. A lot of the work we have in social epistemology is about knowledge integration in equal groups, but once you introduce strong hierarchical relations in the group, a lot of those analyses have to be thought through again. How does that kind of group work for the Kuhnian risk spreading argument, or the essential tension? Puzzle solving efficiency, well, there's a clear division of labor within a narrow focus, so it's highly efficient for solving disciplinary puzzles. That's also what, in a way, the granting agencies expect, that you get a lot of results produced in a very high time, or little time, in this focused area. Ability to locate loci of trouble and to spread risks. You have division of labor, but you may have limited cognitive divergence, so fewer viewpoints to find new angles on where loci of trouble could be. And it depends very much on the character of these submission relations, deference relations, what kind of openness there will be in a group for actually discussing, for pointing out loci of trouble, working on them, discussing them. Even more so if you start working on alternatives, that depends very much on the character of submission and deference, and the option available for the start group picture to sort of split the group is typically not an option for people who are working in the rocket model, especially not if they're at the bottom. In reality, many groups will work as a mixture between interaction between equal experts and hierarchical integration. There may be multiple PIs and co-PIs. Hierarchy may be more gradual, at one top level and one bottom level, so that can provide high efficiency for both disciplinary and interdisciplinary problem solving. Although my intuition would be that interdisciplinary research tends to require more flatness, or require more interaction between equal experts, and locating loci of trouble and spreading risk and developing alternatives depends very much on division of labor, cognitive divergence, types of commitment, shared agency. So this will vary very much between different kinds of groups, and where I think more historical knowledge or more historical studies on the development of such groups is needed, and more work in social epistemology on how groups of different kinds actually are makes conclusions and how they react to divergence. And finally, how does this relate to other presentations or at this workshop? Yesterday, I was very happy to start out with a chat and some coffee with James, where I said that I had highly enjoyed looking at some of his papers, or especially those on how large teams develop and small teams disrupt science and technology, and on how flat teams drive scientific innovation. I think those are studies that are extremely convincing for arguing, for example, to funding agencies that they need to reflect on their practices, or if funding gets too skewed towards one type of funding, the big rockets, although it might give a high immediate return, it may not give the best return for science overall in the long run. And that's also, as I understand it, how James is also using that work in that kind of settings. But playing the devil's advocate, there may be more details to be discovered that I think we can investigate in this kind of group. And some of the things I bring up here, or your group may already have answered, and I'm sorry that I haven't read through your entire production. I think the differences between large and small groups and between flat and hierarchical groups. I would like to learn much more about whether there's a difference between disciplinary and interdisciplinary fields, or in that difference between groups. So that is one thing that I think it would be very interesting to discuss. Another is how these kind of large-scale studies relate to studies that are instead focusing on a particular unit and follows that unit over time, or a center of excellence, for example. If you follow such a center, co-authors are often subsets of a larger team. So could it be that major conceptual papers are often written only by a very select group within a center of excellence, typically PIs, co-PIs, which for those conceptual papers, they would stand out as small group papers, although they're actually authored within a much, much larger setting. So there's something about how to connect studies of institutional units with studies of papers that I think will be fruitful to discuss. And also thinking more along those lines, it could be that those kinds of conceptual papers that really makes the big claims, the big leap forward, often PIs, co-PIs, it could be that occasionally selected, very promising young scholars are participating, that could create the impression that young scholars who have their first publication in a flat author publication are very successful, although they're actually embedded in a much more hierarchical structure, but the paper they're in appears more flat than the center hierarchy they're part of. So again, that is something about connecting unit studies of institutional units with studies of papers. Or no matter what the answer is to those questions, I think that the combination of large-scale empirical studies or micro-studies of the inner working of individual groups and historical studies of how groups and centers develop can provide important information that can be used for granting agencies, and that can also be used for things like the emerging industry of research leader training. That was my contribution.
perfect timing. That gives us at least 20 minutes for Q&A, and then we'll also have enough time for lunch. So let's start with clarifications again, and then sort of ease into the rest of the discussion from there.
Just a clarification, the different sort of groups that you presented, are those sort of thought to be every professional working group? Because you gave most comparisons sort of tailored towards scientists. Do you feel like they sort of apply to all? Are they more unique to academia? Because I reckon you sort of looked at them in a sort of Kuhnian paradigm, but there are also different other areas of, say, innovation or whatnot, where also these disruptions may happen.
I have been thinking in terms of science, and the inspiration we have drawn, Susan Markenlicht and I, originally from Rossini and Porter, they have studied our grant applications, so that's also within the science realm. However, some of the things I'm saying, I have recently discovered that resonates very well with what a figure like Boseman is saying within our science of team science. And I think that he's going much broader than just academia. He's also comparing to many other settings. I'm not making claims on other settings in science, but I do see that there's a literature that makes some of the same points or in different settings.
Thank you so much. I wonder whether you could say a bit more about two of these key terms that are very interesting. That's where you get some hierarchical ones. So can you say a bit more about what this amounts to and how the notion can be operational? I mentioned that some groups, for instance, seems a strong hierarchy. So like sites will just submit the paper and stuff like that. But at the same time, there can be authority over certain issues by the postdocs. These, for instance, right? So there seems hierarchy, potential hierarchy along so many dimensions. Right? How do you reflect this out and measure it?
I agree completely, and I think this is something where I won't be able to spell out the final account, or I can see how in large scale studies we need a certain kind of operationalizing it, or I found it fascinating that you can do that kind of data mining, or where you go by the contribution statements, or I think it would be interesting to triangulate that with work that looks more into our bank or supervising roles. I think that was to some extent also done by James' group, but or James will be better at answering that point than I am. And also epistemic authority and how it plays out in interdisciplinary settings. There is simply work that needs to be done. In some of my work, I have argued that important prerequisite for interdisciplinary work is that it will be possible to transfer anomalies from one field to another. And so those settings where you work interdisciplinarily by having a hired hand whom you just give instructions and he or she does as told and just present it back. If there's not a possibility for that hired hand to come back and say, I'm sorry, but I'm actually discovering this problem and it needs to be taken seriously, then there is a serious problem. And I've worked on that from historical case studies, and I'm not sure how that should be upscaled to large scale studies, but I would be very interested in discussing it.
Thanks. James?
Yeah, great talks, super interesting. Kind of conceptual structure for thinking about different kinds of teams. I had a couple of questions. One, I wasn't clear. I mean, you said the importance of seeing how centers of excellence or large-scale institutes or other centers are in some ways like generative of teams, right? So you can, I mean, it seemed you were suggesting that they're kind of like generators. You got, paper level or project level teams that end up getting like produced recursively as a function of these things. And I wasn't sure if you had analyzed that production process itself, or we're just proposing that would be useful to do.
I'm just proposing.
Okay. No, I agree. Proposal great to do, and I think one could, of course, scale that, to departments or effectively any, to what degree essentially are these generators. One of the things that we, you were talking about all these substructures, and we tried to analyze many of those at scale, and we were challenged, to really kind of develop consistent measures that felt stable across these different contexts. But one thing we did do, and in a paper that's coming out, is, and I'm curious how one might think about this interfaces with the organizational structures you're talking about, is we kind of ask the question, well, if you've got people on these teams that have diverse expertise, and we get at that expertise just as a function of the prior papers and experiences that they've had, and we kind of use rich language models to embed them, and unsurprisingly, diameter matters, right? So if you have diverse expertise, if just the diameter across the whole semantic space is bigger, then that matters for impact, both average but especially variance of impact. So it increases the likelihood that if it succeeds, it will dramatically succeed. But a big moderator, and this was interesting, and I think is probably interfaces with some of these organizational structures, and I'd just love to hear your thoughts on it, is if you imagine, okay, so you could have a big diameter where everyone's either way over here or way over here, So, people could be, art historians over here and molecular biologists over here. I mean, it covers a big extent. Everyone could be over here or over here. And the gap for them to be able to converse and make sense of each other's comments is tough, and, versus that team could be kind of tiled, right? Or tessellated across the space so that the average distance between them is, d divided by n, which is the number of members of the team, right? So, and it turns out that massively moderates this effect. So if you have everybody in the team at the poles, then it's much less likely for the findings to be impactful, for the variance of the success to be large, if it's tiled maximally. So if everyone has somebody to talk to in kind of a small diameter, then it dramatically increases this effect. It's almost a mediator. So I'm just curious, my guess is that, I'm trying to think of how some of these organizational structures would facilitate this kind of like tiling across the space and conversations that would make the synthesis of different ideas meaningful.
I mean, that's really a fascinating result, and I really look forward to reading that paper. My expectation would be that the tiling facilitates a decision structure, or if you have people in radical different ends, then either there has to be a lot of learning going on that they can at all connect their contributions, or you get a kind of decision structure where, I mean, a lot of social epistemology has been drawn in settings that are very far from science. A lot of it has been drawn on how do you take our decisions in our political organizations where everybody sits with our different views, and how do you aggregate these different views, and in the end, everybody agrees to letting a conclusion stand, although you do not necessarily agree to that yourself, which seems there's something very counterintuitive on bringing that view into science, because to have scientists to sit there and say, well, actually I disagree, but yeah, we let it stand, and now I'm this publication, although I don't believe it, or does not strike me as very plausible. And the same goes for if you want to integrate people with very different knowledge or very little connection. there'll also be some element of very radical trust and very radical letting this stand, because there's not this tiling of interaction. So I think that it promotes the decision structure. It also promotes the internal trust in the group. And by promoting the internal trust in the group, it probably also promotes things like the internal quality control, making sure that all the various angles are covered. And it probably also promotes our communication to many different audiences. So I think there are multiple effects in it.
Oh, that's very helpful. Thanks.
Yes, go ahead.
I thought it was quite interesting because, notice like when researchers pick topics, they're often dear to their heart. Yeah. And I noticed like you come from Denmark, and here in the Netherlands, I also noticed they have a much more flat structure. And what we value as cultures may differ. So I was taking a quick skim of your 2015 paper. You mentioned that the integrity of researchers is very important. And I thought it was really interesting to see like this would be a highlight for saying like how to have the research outcome with that we want, which is quality research. And on the other hand, like I can see where cultures may differ in how they interpret what is moral. So for example, we recently did a collaboration during COVID called COVID Stress, and it was a massive collaboration across various countries. And one of the issues that we found when we were doing it was very difficult sometimes to communicate well, and thus to get the outputs that we wanted, the quality all across the different languages that we translated the survey into. And one of the factors was that Western researchers were more likely to speak up, more likely, even if they were just, in a way, they might feel like maybe they don't feel that they were a little guy, but they would view the whole construct as flat. Whereas in Eastern researchers were less likely to speak up, less likely to mention a problem, even if they could see it, unless they were explicitly asked. And it was seen as a virtue. It's seen as a virtue in our cultures to not speak up unless you're asked by the lead. And so we would very much defer to the lead and less likely point out problems. And so, because I grew up in a cross-cultural context, so I try to lead to continually communicate values to the whole group of what is wanted. Please speak up. Your work is valued, to recognize and to request input. Yeah, and another part I found was that also you talked about openness, and you talked about if the little guy speaks up in a hierarchical setting, if there's an openness in that culture, it increases the quality. And what I feel from our cultures is that when somebody makes a mistake, the way we do it, we don't castigate them, or we don't put them down. We try to minimize the mistake. We try to absorb the mistake. That's how we build that trust. So the trust isn't from, per se, transparency, but more from, we do see the faults, but we try to minimize and protect our team members. And that's how the team stays. I mean, this is a generalization of cultures, but it's different levels of, different types of way to view what is moral action in the team.
Thank you. These are really great comments that immediately spurs a lot of thinking on my behalf. I mean, you mentioned my origin in Denmark, and it's right. It's quite interesting. Denmark has always marketed itself or the lack of hierarchy and the flatness, etc. But over the last 20 years, a lot of the research funding has really gone into rockets, and there's a particular foundation that gives really large-scale funding, and they are very explicit that they give it to rockets. And when you communicate with them, I mean, I've tried to communicate with them about ideas that would be more star formation, and I get this pushback. You have to be the rocket. put yourself at the tip. so at the same time, it has also created a lot of challenges because they give large-scale funding. They give large-scale funding for about 10 years. How does a rocket land? Nobody thought about that. So it has created a lot of turbulence within the Danish universities. So they have all these huge rockets that have a lot of power inside the institutions, and suddenly the funding runs out, and the PI in the top gets desperate when there's no fuel tank. that creates a lot of institutional turbulence, or that kind
disappear into outer space.
I try to suggest that we need to think more about the landing modules. Definitely, cultural differences need to be thrown into that kind of model, or when analyzing decision structures, how is it that people come with different expectations? And I think that's also an important part of preparing PRs for the PI role, that they're also more prepared or for embracing such differences and handling such differences. Finally, I think, or I may sometimes tend to focus a little bit too much on the integrity thing of these matters. That's also because I serve on the Danish board for scientific misconduct. So I see the cases we have in the country, and it's important that I also remind myself how few they actually are compared to how much research goes on. But I think there is an important argument to make that I think some of the major cases we see are cases that might have been able to be caught much earlier on before it grew into larger cases if there was more communication within a group on when results are odd, strange, fishy, you don't really understand. This openness to question, and this continuously considering, is my trust in what is reported here, and is my trust in what I get from this collaborator calibrated? That could actually spare us for some of the major cases because it was caught earlier on. And there's some literature that shows that some cases of misconduct actually starts out from junior scholars who really want to please a PI. They don't get the result that they know the PI wants, and then they start squeezing, and at some point the squeezing gets out of hand. So there is something we can do for the benefit of science by working on that.
Thanks. Yeah, go ahead.
Thank you for the great talk. Actually, your comment just spurred an alternate sort of dimension, which is how sometimes it can be that on the question of integrity, that the responsibility of challenging the status quo may lie on the ECR or the early career researcher. And then when you question, actually the ECR might be penalized more for challenging the status quo just in the hierarchy of power structures. And actually this flat hierarchy could mitigate that. But in traditional structures, and irrespective, if you do challenge status quo, that does sort of fall upon you, and that can sort of result in different ways. So I guess I'd be curious to hear how we can sort of take that responsibility and sort of ensure that, to maximize integrity at the ECR level, how can we ensure that younger scholars don't get penalized and then sort of leave because you realize there's very little you can do to fight those structures.
And I said this before, that I have only recently realized that some of what I'm saying resonates very well with what our Boersman is saying within the science of team science. He has a publication where he talks about different group structures, or the group organizations are tyrannical, where the PI just dictates and doesn't care about anybody, or the structure where the PI dictates without being as hostile as a tyrant, or the structure where the PI wants to draw in our other members, but does it by assuming what the group members think without necessarily checking. And are those where some group members are asked, other group members are not asked, and then the flat hierarchy where everybody is drawn in. And his expectation is that it's about 5 to 10% of groups that are of the latter kind. It's also only 5 to 10% that are tyrannical, but his expectation is that here is really something to work on, also because he also gets thought that the most efficient groups are those that have the flat hierarchy, and that's on the basis of work that goes also into other sectors than science. The example you brings up with COVID, of course, emphasizes that this account is also just a little blurb of the large picture, because all those relations that then come from outside that affects decision structures are due to power relation to funding agencies, to our ministries, whatever, or that's totally absent in the account I have given, but in reality, of course, that plays a big role.
Thanks.
Now, once we've raised my favorite topic, research and technology, in your talk, you seem to have alluded to the fact that you argue for research integrity education, catering for group interaction and group function as well. And I agree, but there is little evidence that research education works. In fact, there is some evidence that it works in the wrong direction. So maybe, I'm curious what you think about the following. Some people, and I'm one of them, think that there is essential amplification by the way we assess researchers. We now dominantly assess them by counting citations and publications, and there are all types of reforms going on, which is interesting. And I would argue that to make research integrity education in your proposal more effective, we need to award the stuff that matters. How do you function as a group member? How do you promote a healthy group interaction? How do you contribute by being an excellent supervisor, for instance, and withdraw a little bit from the current perverse incentives? Do you agree that that amplification might be essential?
I think that is clearly one element that is extremely important. I think there's room for improvement for both in both your direction and my direction at the same time. I think what I'm arguing is that a lot of integrity training, of course, it doesn't hold for all of it, but a lot of integrity training has this emphasis on this is what you're allowed to do, this is what you're not allowed to do, this is where you go to report when you see somebody who is totally out of line. But we do not really prepare people for, okay, it's very rare that we encounter these things that are totally out of line. How is it that we react in daily practice when something is just a little bit odd? And how is it that we raise questions without immediately saying, I think you're cheating, also because often in the first steps, it may actually be quite difficult to distinguish whether it's lack of integrity or whether it's lack of competence that leads to the first steps. And that makes it even more important to be able to raise the first questions, to have this openness, to look into it, both from junior collaborators and also from supervisors. So to give training that prepare people from that conversation without having this edge of, oh, you're a morally evil person and I'm going to report it. I think that would be important steps as well.
That's a really good point. And it also bears on the pleas we have heard the last few days on flatness of organizations and research groups.
All right, I'm going to draw this session to a close. So thank you, Hanne, again.